Well, we have today Jennifer Bonner, who is a practicing architect based in Boston, founder of MOL, a name with multiple possible meanings: mass architectural loop-de-loops, or miniature angles and little lines, or maximum arches with limited liability. Jennifer received a Master of Architecture from Harvard University in 2009, where she was awarded the James Kelly, the Kelly Prize, for her project Assemblage of Twins. Since graduating, she has taught at Woodbury in Los Angeles, Auburn University, the Architectural Association in London, Lund University, Georgia Institute of Technology, and is currently an assistant professor here at the GSD, as probably all of you know. Jennifer's CV and range of interests is, I would say, as eclectic as impressive. This is clear even in the ambiguous or open-ended acronym, MOL, which is the name of her practice. This is a name that announces an intellectual project that isn't afraid to assert that we can't say that we have it all figured out yet. In this sense, Jennifer's work belongs to an emerging generation of architects who understand architecture as a fearlessly blind search for moments of openness, anomaly, and alternative possibilities, within an eternally present historical perspective, I would say. In her own words, and I like this quotation a lot, in search of authenticity, we are most happy when we achieve misbehavior in architecture. We are committed to projects that reappropriate history, hack typologies, reference cultural events, and invent representation. So join me welcoming her and seeing this. We will have Michael Hayes responding and Sergio López Piñero, so I think it will be fun today. So please come, Jennifer.
Oh, good, that's a big one. Okay, thank you, Iñaki, for asking me to present the work this semester during the Innovate lecture series. And as the title of this talk suggests, I'd like to make a close reading of the good old ordinary. And I'll do this by showing work formed around a singular topic, not the kind of general overview lecture about my practice. In art and architecture, a close reading, also known as formal analysis, is generally reserved for the canon, the precedent project, or those referring to historical lineages of the immediate or far past. But in this body of work, I will argue for a close read of the ordinary, the overlooked, the throwaways, and the stuff that is immediately accessible, but usually tossed aside. So can we turn the lights? Okay. To some of you, this might feel like a painfully slow reading of ordinary domestic roof typologies. For others, especially those of you thinking about thesis, the advancement of taking a slow, long look is imperative. Or put another way, it might just be a Southern thing to embrace the slow. Lastly, in order to turn this into a meta project, I ask that all of you make a close reading of the work directly following the talk by doing close readings on the close reading. But before we immediately discard the canon, I wanted to give the modernist camp a very tiny cameo role in the talk. And as I sift through several known single-family houses, I'm left completely underwhelmed for ideas on novel roof forms. The Germans, the Austrians, the Americans, all of this effort towards the flat roof, yet sometimes looking back only perpetuates business as usual. So jumping straight into what is at stake in the work, I ask the questions, what is the ordinary and why is the ordinary relevant now? The ordinary is what I've termed as the contractor stockpile of all things pertaining to the roof. The lingo goes like this: eaves, ridges, valleys, rakes, soffits, gables, hips, and dormers. One of the literary references for the contractor stockpile is Hawthorne's House of Seven Gables, and the hashtag is domestic hats. If we consider the contractor as a geometrist for a moment, then it is possible to think about these piles of 2x6s and wood frame construction as a project of planar inclination. And I might go so far as to say that these geometries are the American version of the contemporary cathedral, which for purposes of the close reading was all about the roof. In the contractor stockpile, there are endless variations of the domestic roof pitch with slopes such as 3 to 12, 7 to 12, or 9 to 12. This straightforward catalog of basic roof typologies, the shed, dormer, gable, mansard, and hip roofs, are so commonplace that we've overlooked the spatial possibilities these roof types begin to produce when we flip our thinking about how they might affect the project of interiority. Current modes of construction from the contractor camp promote vented roofs, yet the unvented roof allows visual connection to what is otherwise deemed as attic geometry. What happens in the attic stays in the attic, as in the example on the left, where we almost never see the underbelly of the roof in the vented roof condition. On the other hand, I'd like to be very clear about what I'm not interested in the project of the ordinary. I'm not interested in how these generic roofs have become the developer's tool for covering sprawling floor plans for large suburban single-family houses, as seen in the example on the left. Rather, I'm curious about the leftover results, the formal qualities when they are mashed up, misaligned, and result in awkward forms, as seen in the example on the right. So in the floor plan, roof plan overlay, the diagonal seams indicate where the floor plan expands and receives another roof. So it's basically the place where the bullion happens. And while the ridges either lengthen or shorten based on the far or near reach of the next roof. But I find this to be problematic because decisions are based on tending to the floor plan first and conceding that the roof plan should follow suit. And these tendencies attenuate the possibilities of the roof problem. All of these disciplinary questions tell me that the age-old problem of the roof is not going away, and we're going to continue to grapple with it for a few more centuries to come. Okay, so now I'd like to offer a second version of the close reading. So what's to follow is 16 slides and 16 descriptors in a slightly different lingo. Figure 1 demonstrates how a gable roof is covered by a hip roof. In Figure 2, we have a gable smothered by a double hip. And this might start to sound like a way of ordering food at Waffle House down south, where hash browns are served up, scattered, smothered, covered, and topped. In Figure 4, 2 intersected gables with offset and misaligned shed roofs. Chamfered triple hips with asymmetrical extruded gables. And so I wanted to have a closer look at Figure 5 because I think there's a lot going on here. I don't want y'all to miss it. So we have, I need to see right here, I guess. So we have 3 gables, 1, 2, 3, but you have to look closely because the shed is like wedged in between gable 1 and 2. And then you see we have like perpendicular stacked gables on the back. And then we have this, we can't forget about the dormer over here. But then is that 1 dormer or is that 2 dormers? And did I miscount the first gable when it's actually a dormer? So, I mean, it starts to get pretty complicated fast. In Figure 7, stacked, stretched, and clipped gables are also known as the gable stack. Figure 8, mega hip and 5 extruded gables with a lined, rotated mini gable in the bottom right. Figure 9, stacked and shifted double hip with 2 extruded gables and a revolved half gable. piggybacked hip dormer nested on two bullioned gables. Figure 11, intersected, rotated gables with camelback mini gable and a revolved half gable at the corner. Are y'all seeing all of this? Figure 12, flat gable face with perpendicularly extruded stacked gables. Intersecting gables scaled and then stacked. Front-facing gable with a camelback hip plus a rotated gable with a mini gable bump in the back. 15, a double gable stacked onto double hips. And finally, in figure 16, we have a stair-stepped hip with misaligned stacked double hip and a palm tree. So to conclude with a third version of the close reading, I wanted to show a brief 2-minute clip from the only other person I could find with a shared affinity towards the good old ordinary roof types. So meet Alan.
Hi, I'm Alan Hilsbeck Jr., registered interior designer and certified master kitchen and bath designer. Today we are going to explore architectural drawings. We're going to be talking about today how to draw roof lines on a building. As you can see here, we're going to be drawing roof lines on a residence. Drawing roof lines is very simple and as easy as connecting the dots. However, there are several important things that you must know when drawing roof lines correctly. The first step in drawing roof lines on a building is to establish the outside of the roof. This is simply done by taking your first floor plan and projecting out the overhang. Usually this occurs between 12 and 17 inches on most residential structures. The lines drawn here represent a hip roof. A hip roof is when you take the corners of a building and you connect the dots. The hip roof usually lays back when you're looking at a residence. The second type of roof to show in a roof plan is a gable roof. The gable roof in a roof plan is shown by a single line connecting from the center point between two corners. This is usually shown as a triangle when you're looking at a residence. Now, as you can see here in this roof plan, we have now connected the hip roof with the gable roofs to form the roof plan. Again, simply connecting the dots between the roof types. As you can see, we have a hip roof, several hip roofs, and a gable roof. So whether you're drawing a hip roof, a gable roof, or no matter what style of roof you're drawing, it's simply connecting the dots. So until next time, this is Alan Hilsbeck Jr., registered interior designer and certified master kitchen and bath designer of Hilsbeck Design Associates. Have a great day.
He had a different accent for roof. Roof. Okay. Now on to the work. I mean, that was the work, but this is more work. Under the heavy influence of the contractor's stockpile and deviations from the standard, Domestic Hats was the first design project to test ideas on the ordinary. The research began by taking a fairly random sample of 50 houses in the city of Atlanta, cut through approximately 8 different neighborhoods. And we noticed a few tendencies about this collection. Firstly, the roof geometries in more affluent neighborhoods, such as Virginia Highlands, were more convoluted, elaborate, and complex, while lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, such as Old Fourth Ward, appeared to have more humble roof lines. Object 21 is located in Buckhead, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. And as you can see, a mashup of 8 different roof typologies is required to cover 6,000 square foot of space. And at the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, Object 41 represents a singular hip roof covering a simple dog trot house in the neighborhood of Cabbagetown. And as the recipient of the Young Architects Forum's Emerging Voices Award, we were asked to make a solo exhibition in a 10,000 square foot gallery space in Atlanta's West Side. And Domestic Cats consist of 16 large massing models measuring 3 foot by 5 foot by 3 foot in height, and what we call a mega massing model measuring 12 foot by 20 foot by 6 feet in height. And so I'll just explain more on the role of the massing model in a moment, but first I want to take a closer look at what we made. So in figure A, you see hips, gables, dormers, A-frames, sheds, mansards combined in 6 parts. In massing A, we intentionally included 6 different roof types and a 6-square grid to see how a larger organizational device might prompt unauthorized valleys and ridges. Radial hips with minimum and maximum ridge lines as a way of distorting the original found combination of hip roofs. In this massing, ridge lines are no longer parallel to the floor plane. This one's called the iconic gable front with 11 exploded and piled miniature gables in the back. Hip roofs with oblique cuts and shifted valleys. 2 sets of incrementally scaled gables with aligned and misaligned camelbacks. And in this massing model, what happens when an A-frame no longer produces a snug fit with the adjoining gable? Or when a hip roof no longer sits symmetrically as the primary volume? Orientation still matters when working on the ordinary, but large roof surfaces respond much differently than small, densely packed, inward-looking roof surfaces. And this is the kind of final result of the 16. Excessive amounts of formal qualities emerge when looking at all 16 from the top view. Primary ridges meet secondary valleys, and everything becomes confused when the dormer starts to take over. Or volumes deny allegiance to cardinal directions, and scattered roof lines produce scattered plans. And finally, hips tend to exploit the oblique, but when misaligned hips are piled and elongated, the legibility of the original hips and oblique starts to become blurred. So the representational strategy agenda for this project involves 2 axonometric drawings for each of the 16 models, yet demonstrating a different intentionality in each. One axon engages the very top of the roof as a single razzle-dazzle surface, as in the drawing on the right, and the other represents the vectors required to cut foam model in our 4-axis wire cutter. And I think these drawings don't look very good on the projector, so sorry about that. Domestic Cats also rethinks the role of the massing model in architectural representation. Massing models are usually small in size and result in the iterative design process by the architect. They represent the schema, the diagram, or the proto-architecture. Lacking detail and often made out of singular material, massing models distinguish differences in a volumetric study. Let's make it slightly thinner, no, a little longer, or better yet, let's make it fatter. Domestic Cats delights in these tendencies to engage multiples, but rejects the constraint of smallness. For these purposes, the models are scaled up to an awkward size without the luxury of more detail or information. And they weren't easily transportable, and they didn't fit in the frame of our foam wire cutter. The massing models included in the installation are not even large enough to be considered a pavilion, nor do they sit comfortably on a client's conference room table. Intentionally inflated, they merely represent themselves, no longer a representational stand-in for something else. So on opening night, the work was lit by spots with a primary focus on the roof surface. So it allowed for several different elevational faces to be rendered in shadow, so you can see the kind of shearing effect. And at other times, the elevational face and the top Roof surfaces were also evenly lit. And then several of the members of the Domestic Hats team were removed from the gallery and taken back out into the city, only to be dropped off as yard art on the front lawns of the original houses sampled during the initial research phase. These neighborhood friends began to show off novel forms of the ordinary when positioned alongside the standard gables, hips, and dormers. And just as the plywood has been sheathed over the wood framing of the contractor stockpile is operating at its best, Domestic Hats here, found sitting on the front porch, meets its match in the real one-to-one example of the overscaled massing model. Okay, the second project's much shorter, and I just wanted to briefly show, it's called House Gables, and it's a residential project we're currently working through and in process. So I won't talk about things like windows and materiality just yet, but I know I can talk about the roof and the project of interiority. So rather than combining many roof types as previously seen in Domestic Hats, this project explores an invented prompt, Flannery O'Connor style, a good gable is hard to find, and limits the investigation to the use of the gable in isolation as a single roof type. So these are back to the pitches up from the contractor stockpile. They tend to utilize slopes under 12 to 12 or under 45-degree angles, but House Gables exploit steeper pitches outbound of the known standards. Sited on a narrow lot with only 18 feet construction width, House Gables revels in the potential of formal shearing due to the straightforward setbacks and the maximum building envelope. Finally, House Gables is made up of a cluster of 6 gables and 6 pitches, which are then grouped in pairs of 2 and intersected and bullioned. A series of worm's eye views of the roof's underbelly illustrate steep slopes such as 14 to 12, 17 to 12, or 19 to 12. And so the elevation, you start to get strange profiles of the ordinary gable, and this starts to emerge on all 4 elevations. The primary long elevation has some conjoined kind of gables here, right? And then you would think you would see 2 more, but then you kind of get this elongated, stretched condition happening in the rear of the house. And in the curbside short elevation, House Gables authors unfamiliar forms as the typical, almost expected gable face is clipped on an oblique corner, offering asymmetrical authority on the first glance. And at the rear of the house, 2 gables are sheared again and result in 2 half-gable figures. And so what does all of this mean in the lineage of the free plan and the ROM plan paradigms? I'm trying to promote there is room for the roof plan. So the roof plan is another organizational device, but its starting point is not with the floor. And so you get these kind of different double height spaces, kind of L-shaped spaces. You get single height, but they're more connected to the roof condition. And so this is the ground floor and the roof plan, and then the second level and the third level. And you can see where double height spaces start to inflect in the plan. You enter through a stair, which is a gable, and that's your kind of first orientation with the gable. What else can I say about this? So this is the last elevation. I think we could stop there. Thanks so much.
Iñaki, you have to come too.
No, I'm the moderator. You go to...
one of the things, I'm not quite sure what to do with this case, so, so we're going to explore. But one of the things in the last few slides, I was waiting or trying to anticipate consequences of the research. I mean, to look into ordinary, I mean, the most familiar thing that you start, that I think that most of us would start with would be the sort of Venturi Scott Brown looking into Levittown or Las Vegas of the 60s. And so the consequences were urban and architectural, but not tectonic and not material. I think that's true. And what was striking about starting with the roof plan, because, well, then the comparison, I think, with domino, round plan, and then roof plan. I think you should say round plan so you can say roof plan, right? So that you have to distinguish. Do you think? Yeah. Is that the tectonic consequences are right up front in the sense that it requires balloon framing. I think it seems to me that, I mean, I don't know if the students realize, I mean, I don't know if we teach this in the sort of technology courses, that American balloon framing, and I don't know if anyone knows in Europe if domestic architecture is still largely balloon frame or not. I don't know. Maybe in the Netherlands it is. No, it's not. So it is peculiarly American, and it rests absolutely on the recalcitrance of the building industry and the insistence on using sort of 2x4, 2x6s, and nail guns, because nail guns are, it makes, without the nail gun, it wouldn't, well, first of all, without the nail, it wouldn't exist, but also without the nail gun, because it goes so incredibly fast that it becomes mass-produced, even though it's made by hand. They still call it stick-built. And it seems to me that the way the roofs are formed depends on that. So the sort of tectonic implications are immediate. And then I think the comparison with domino is interesting, because domino was first billed as the architecturalization of the concrete as a building system. It was built totally in terms of sort of standardized concrete, but what it actually sponsored completely different consequences, like the free plan. But also, I think we've done this in our Corbusier class, Antoine and I. You can actually go from the domino all the way to Chandigarh. That you can actually still see the domino in Chandigarh. So, which is to say that the urban implications come back, and the hint we get of the consequences at the stair is registers with or coordinates with the roof. But pretty much everything else is orthogonal still. Is that right? And so the next step would be what happens urbanistically. So what I'm trying to say is that Scott Brown and Venturi get architectural and urbanistic consequences. Le Corbusier and the domino get architectural and eventually urban consequences. And I wonder if you would get urban consequences. Maybe Los doesn't, unless it's unless it's an urban consequence that it turns inward. It withdraws, but I don't know that otherwise that it gets any urban consequences. So the one thing I would look for is where this could go would be what happens urbanistically. I think putting those things in the front yard, there's a different dimension. I found that very. I'm sure there's a photographic technique or a filmic technique that when a ghost appears somehow out of place in a scene, I don't know, we were talking about in Le Jeté, which is a film made only of stills, except there's the one moment when the woman blinks her eyes. To me, the white things in the yard had that same effect of, you think you're looking at a still picture, but it blinks its eyes. There's the hauntedness that I think is actually in the realm of the urban. I mean, that would be one you know, a bit of the urban that would happen. Sergio, help me, please.
I think you were doing pretty well. I like that this idea of like trying to figure out the consequences or the influences of these. Let's say the influence of the gay ball at an urban scale, so, to frame it along the words. I was looking at your presentation from another point of view. Maybe I was interested in your formal analysis, but at the same time, I mean, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, your close reading is a parallel of the traditional formal analysis that is reserved for canonical buildings, and therefore looks at canonical proportions and aesthetic aspects. And I was interested in seeing how generally formal analysis eliminates any form of ordinary problem. And I was interested in, since you were doing a close reading of the good old ordinary, if you're going to incorporate somehow ordinary problems into the whole issue. So that was another way of like looking at your presentation. You had this slide that had the unvented versus the vented roof, and you were explaining how in one case you're able to experience the attic space, while in another one you can't. But from a ordinary point of view, these two different roofs have very different consequences that would produce very different ordinary problems in different climates. One would produce ice dams, the other one wouldn't. One would produce leaks, the other one do it. And so there was like this other like look at the consequence of this ordinariness, like really like taking it like very, very ordinary, even more so. So I wasn't trying to like maybe like retrofit your work within the architectural theory, although I really like what you were doing, Michael. I was just trying to like push it to even like much more ordinary. Like for instance, the balloon frame, I would be really interested in seeing how you can actually, I mean, you wouldn't be able to really construct these roofs without digital fabrication in a way. It would be impossible. So you need a high degree of sophistication within the construction industry in order to achieve this level of ordinariness. And I think that these kind of relationships, I think to me were like kind of like interesting and maybe insightful into the you know, general everyday issues and others that are much more disciplinary. But this idea of like connecting it to, you know, historical traditions or genealogies is also quite nice. I don't know. I wonder.
I don't know. Do you think that it requires sophisticated building techniques?
This one, like I would just imagine them. I mean, I really wonder, like the base of each of these 2x4s is going to have to be cut at a different angle.
But has anyone ever been a carpenter in the room? No, at least one. Because the way they do it in Alabama, I know, you don't actually. The one thing you measure is the ridge.
Right.
From that point on, you hold up a 2x6 and mark it and cut it and nail it, and you don't ever measure. You don't use an angle or a compass or it's just you hold up a 2x6, you mark it and cut it. So and it's so fast. And it's not sophisticated.
But you think it would be possible to produce this level of complexity with that?
Field, help me. No?
Yeah, I mean, you just read off the measurements, and someone's on the chop saw, and they're just down there kind of
At best, yeah. No, because the ridge controls, the ridge is the only thing, is the controlling line. It's like a ruled surface, you only have one rule. I mean, right?
I don't know. I mean, I was
everything else is just contingent.
I was thinking. I mean,
No?
to keep it vernacular, I was thinking of several. Within the Spanish context, I was thinking of particularly one roof that, in order to be built, I think it was the 17th century, that implied a huge geometric development in order to understand the geometry of the wood and how it had to be cut and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at this thing, and because of the number of angles, because of the fact that a lot of the joints do not happen on the same plane, they happen at different, I would imagine that it would, I don't know, I mean, maybe it is possible to do it in such a, on the field, a straightforward manner, just like, but I'm not sure that would be completely possible. And so, I don't know, I was seeing that contradiction or that friction as a productive way of like continue to talk or like reveal the insightfulness of the work.
Jennifer, can you comment?
Yeah, this is kind of like therapy, you know, after you like make the close reading and then you have to like I have to take it in for a minute. But where I'm kind of questioning things right now is, because I've been thinking a lot about how the soffit look, how the eaves look, how these like 2x6s are cut. And I'm wondering, and then I have this massing model as a representational strategy, but it's actually a real intention, I think, that I would not build the eaves and the soffit. Those kind of normative things start to disappear, and I would literally try to build the mass. And what does that mean? And what does that mean, like, in terms of materiality? So it's like jumping out of the vernacular, out of the normative, out of the ordinary, into some other language, tectonic language.
But you would still build these with a balloon frame system.
Yes,
I
but
think you have to. But also, I think whether it's a mass or whether it's a volume matters at that point. Whether you conceive of it as a mass, because the fact is the white things are carved.
Yeah.
But what they're representing is a very thin surface over a volume. And I think that the way you conceptualize that would make a lot of difference how you go forward.
Yeah, can I add to this a question on why do you call it ordinary? I mean, at the same time you say that is the American Cathedral, the balloon frame. No? I mean, which is
so I'm like promoting the ordinary.
yeah, but, and if so, I think that the effect of your installations is basically the contrast among the roof and the cut. And this never happens. I mean, the roof always is driven by the movement in the facade. And I remember that, I don't think it was maybe Nash, it was a British architect in the 18th century, the first that talked about movement in the volumes to create a picturesque effect and avoiding the cornice and bringing a kind of completely different thing. And it was a kind of an issue about the character of architecture. I mean, it was very much related, and I think it was Collins in the book of Collins where they discussed this thing. I mean, I don't remember, but it was more about movement than about the ordinary. And you haven't mentioned this kind of contrast among your straight and this, and I think it's very important for the beautiful effect of your models. Can you elaborate on the ordinary?
Yeah, I mean the shearing takes us out of the ordinary because it's a design act which clips or cuts the, I mean you see it everywhere, right? You're then being kind of confronted with the gable from a different reading because of the cut. And so the cut, yeah, I didn't talk about it any, you're right, but it's actually really important as one of the techniques for allowing us to see the gable with a different face or a different, you see it in all of the last images.
And the cathedral? Why haven't you
That's just
mentioned
me
it?
trying to like promote American weirdness or strangeness. And yeah, what is the contemporary cathedral? Is it Walmart right now, or is it these balloon frame houses that are kind of ubiquitous?
Yeah, yes, I mean, I open now. But I was thinking that because of the abstract scale of these volumes, they could be gigantic in a way. No? And this is another reading. They are not domestic at all. Which is something interesting from my point of view.
I know you're going to open it, but just one more quick thing. There's something about also, I think, that this challenges actually typologies that distinguish cathedral from house in this sense. I'm thinking, and someone correct me on this, I think in the Forbidden City, the Chinese capitals and the Chinese sort of ornaments that hold up the roof, my memory is that over time, everything is repeated except the roof details tectonically get more elaborate, but they don't change. There's not a hierarchy of low and high like domestic versus, or because everything's imperial, so it's all the same hierarchy. But what happens is the roof structure gets more elaborate in time, in a smooth way, I think. And I think that's interesting that typologically you don't get kind of these discrete moments of hierarchy. You get a smooth progression. And I think the rules are like that. Even though the one you started with Buckhead versus Cabbagetown, and in Atlanta that really means all kinds of social things. It means racial things. It means class things. It's really important. And actually blurring that, you see what I'm saying? That blurring Cabbagetown versus Buckhead actually has social implications as well as morphological urban implications.
Questions, comments, ideas? Yeah, please.
I have one.
You can always count on Tony.
I was really struck by the connection between the way that the monoliths are projected and like the Hugh Ferris drawings, these Hugh Ferris black monoliths within the urban context that have the same kind of articulation as a formalist operation, and the slicing along the sides also align very much with what Iñaki was pointing out, that they get cut. But what was interesting there was that was a response to the setback project. That was a project that responded to the standardization of zoning of spaces of public domain. And yours, I think, what I found most interesting, and because it conflicts, is that in the Maison, there is no roof. And a lot of the projects you talked about their bases, there was no roof. And yours starts with roof and tries to reverse engineer the Maison from something that it doesn't even contain. The Maison's meant to be free in all directions, pretty much. So I'm intrigued by the idea of the slicing existing as a formal operation, but also as an operation that it seems to erase any other connotation of the dwelling within it. It seems to almost reverse the infinity aspect of the Maison going vertically by turning the infinity going downward. So it almost seems both formalized the way that we were talking about, but conceptually it says the gables aren't a result of something, they are the result, and I'm reversing the operation backwards. And so I don't really need to have that overhang, because the overhang is the formalist operation. That's my choice to make it overhang. But in reality, if I start with the roof and work backwards, there is no overhang. Why would there be one if I'm not responding to anything? So I think the operation between the abstract monolith and the formalized object has like a really interesting pinnacle when they become these mediums where they're too big to be models, but too small to be real buildings. And I think that's where I was mostly struck by the project and its kind of object, and because of its whiteness, the fact that it is not meant to feel like this heavy Hugh Ferris model that's imposing, but they do have that ghostly soft nature of existing between the abstract and the formal kind of operation.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Yeah, because I mean, that's a really nice reading, and when I was looking at the particularly at the images of the opening, what was interesting to me was to always keep in mind that this was a balloon frame system, and so that they were built in the building technique that you were using was that of the domestic scale, while the actual outcome could be that of a cathedral, right, could be that of like of a very, very large building. And I think that maybe within your presentation, you somehow hide that kind of like tectonic or building technology aspect, which is really what is the ordinary thing, is the find that is like, you go to Home Depot, you buy the stuff, you get back, and then you build it. And all of that was completely a little bit hidden or made opaque within the presentation. And you're just like concentrating on the actual formal outcome. But to me, the interesting thing is the fact that it's like you're achieving potentially the scale of this is a scaleless in a way. They could potentially be a Walmart, but the system of actually like conceptualizing them is really rooted on very, very ordinary building techniques. And I think to me that kind of ambivalence or ambiguity is what is really striking me as one of the most interesting things of the work.
Yes, please.
Just
Wait a moment. I mean, we are recording. Yeah.
I'm just curious what dialogue, if any, there was with other architects who have investigated roof typologies. I'm thinking of, I guess I'm kind of prefiguring, I guess, your talk, Michael's talk later today, but kind of Hajduk, how like over the course of looking at the 9 square and then eventually looking at sort of a 3 by 3 by 3 sort of cube, he starts to realize that just kind of, he can begin with the elevation, he can begin with the roof, it just doesn't matter, it's always a 9 square. Mm-hmm. And so like as he goes through the 7 houses, you start to see him pull the elevation off and begin with the elevation, or pull the roof off and begin with the roof and extrude it downwards. So I'm just kind of curious what dialogue there was with other architects who did at certain points in their investigations begin to treat the roof plan as a departure point for the entire structure. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I was just obsessively looking at these found contractor conditions. And so I really I literally shut out the canon. Like I wasn't referencing contemporary works, mid-century works. I mean, it was just kind of totally removed. So that isolation that I put on myself for this body of work, I think is an important one, because oftentimes I do look at historical works and they are, mean much more to the kind of outcome. Is anything coming to mind?
Well, no, I mean, I was just curious because even in that sort of isolation, right, as you started to think about how you were going to aggregate these and sort of organize these, you turned to a grid, nevertheless, right? Like I guess it was a 2x3. So some of these operations still exist within individual cubes, right? If it's a shear, whether you're halving it or cutting it along the diagonal, or extracting different portions, it's still existing within that kind of language. So I was just curious if at some point, because of that, you turned to other examples of architects or artists who worked in that way. Sol LeWitt, for instance, right? He didn't precisely read it in terms of architecture, but again, taking these sorts of cubes and then deciding on different subdivisions and then beginning to cast them and place them in public space, in parks, for instance. I'm just curious.
Yeah, full disclaimer, Mahfouz is working on the 9 Square and his studio projects. It's like on your mind, which is exciting.
Well, first, thank you, Jennifer, for sharing. I think that everyone really appreciated you kind of sharing this research with us. It's not the kind of thing that we see lots of times. So,
And you've seen it twice, Alex.
I know.
So I'm really worried about what you're going to say.
well, I'll ask a question I wasn't allowed to ask last time, I think, but it is about the premises of the project. And I'll take you up on your challenge to close read the close reading, and ask about what you mean by ordinary. And so my close reading is that you were very careful, even though it came up in the first comment, you were very careful not to situate this project against Venturi, for instance, and late 20th century examples, but exclusively looks to modernism. And I would like to kind of interrogate the ordinary in the context of a different modernist debate, one happening about the same time as Maison Domino, but in our parallel discipline of kind of painting sculpture, let's say. And that's between Picasso and Duchamp. Picasso, who is insisting on the figure and formal ingenuity, and Duchamp, who is looking at the ready-made and the authorial index of choosing some kind of ordinary object. It would seem as if this project has a foot in both camps, because, and I think this might be problematic. That's why I want to ask. So it would seem that you are enjoying the kind of formal results of this process in the lineage of Picasso and the figures that you draw, but also that your insistence on the found object is doing something different. It's the kind of intellectual turn that the ordinary isn't so ordinary. And I wonder how you would further explain ordinary in that context.
I mean, yeah, that's what I just wrote down while you were writing this, that my response was going to be, we all know there's nothing ordinary about the ordinary. But why is it problematic to be concerned with both? I'm very happy to have a foot in both.
Yeah. I think it has to do with the
Discourses.
status of representation. So Picasso refuses always to represent found objects. There's one collage from, I think, 1913 that he almost presents a whole piece of a box, but he doesn't do it. He cuts off the corner. And I think that we could kind of simply read that as him kind of suggesting that representation in his medium is different from the, let's say, the world, or different from objects you might find in the world. I think that you're interested in that as well. because you talked about novel representational strategies. Duchamp is basically doing the opposite thing, and the status of his representation changes as a result. So that's why I think it's difficult to occupy both camps.
Any other question? Comment? Yeah,
Tom.
please. Oh, yeah, please. Tom.
What?
Last house.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to.
Right.
Soon, very quick. I gotta get it built. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I just think that's when it's going to get very interesting. Because of the discussion of the balloon frame versus a balloon frame as found object, let's say, or balloon frame as figure. And very quickly the eaves becomes the question, and that funny paper that you use on roofs, kind of felt, kind of like made like slates. And the whole question of roof and form and edge and ordinary and extraordinary and superordinary will kind of come to bear very quickly, it seems to me, on... I mean, you seem to be more interested, actually, in elevations than roofs, in the kind of picturesque line of it. And it seems like it'll be in there that... Because if you lose the foot in the camp of the ordinary, then it's going to become something else, and then it will have a funny relationship, won't it? It'll be alien to its surroundings, or is alien like the photos of the models in the host houses, the ghost situation. And I think that it's the navigation of all those interesting kind of difficulties, let's say, practical difficulties, will lie the results of the research somehow. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Michael asked if anybody was a carpenter here, and now I just kind of
And
hit.
no one was.
But I raised my hand and you didn't see me.
Oh, no, I know. Well, you
So-
and Keel, yeah.
So-
No, I mean, no students were.
I just kind of made the mental leap that I built this big roof at the Rural Studio in West Alabama in 2002, and we did exactly what you described, which was we had made this like complicated roof geometry. We thought, I was like up at night wondering how are we going to build it. I had 3 other partners. I was kind of relying on them, like they were going to come up with some answer. We literally show up at the site. We take a string from ridge to ridge, all these points. We just, as Michael described, just struck a line with the triangle, and we knew all the angles. Every single 2x6 was cut at a different angle on both ends, and everyone was a different length. And this was like we were just using AutoCAD at the time, and we didn't even figure it out on the computer. We just figured it out on site. So yeah, these are all concerns of mine. I think what Sergio was talking about, I don't know, you seem to think that this was going to get more digitally complex or something, but I think I tend to agree with Michael that it's just basic angles and basic like sticks, and there's not that much really going on here. It's
Well, and
pretty.
the sheathing.
What do you think, Keel?
It covers it up, too.
It's not a framing problem, it's a flashing problem.
Right.
But Tom, I really appreciate your reading that. I'm just really after figuring out elevations. I like that.
Yeah, but there's something that Tom said reminded me, when you think about the materiality, the overall materiality, I don't know where, I was assuming all this was in Atlanta, but is it Atlanta or it's in the South?
What?
All the
Houses? No, the ones that are
Yeah.
close read on?
Yeah,
No, they're all over the country.
they're all over the
I
country.
didn't want to promote like a critical regionalism or like a local condition. We build how the 16 are
Okay.
from like Arizona, Kentucky,
Okay.
Ohio.
For some reason, but I think it works anyway. There's something, there's a peculiar condition in Atlanta that outside the perimeter, there is an explosion of domestic construction along the lines of the one you showed in Buckhead. What's the Atlanta reality TV show? No, it's a family's name. Anyway, they
Oh, Chrisley knows
the
best.
Chrisley Knows Best. There's an explosion of Chrisley. It's called Chrisley Knows Best. It's about a rich Atlanta family, and there's an explosion of this kind of building outside the periphery. And the fact is, I think that any of these you build would actually be fairly unapparent. There's so much of this kind of construction that I think it would actually be fairly easy and unapparent and not very spectacular. That's the other, no. But I'm trying to justify the ordinary. There is something, everyone is seeing extraordinary things about it, but when it gets built, it's going to look like Chris Lee knows best, I think. No? I mean, I don't know if that's a danger for you or a good thing for you, but yeah.
Mm.
Are we the only ones who watch Chris Lee Knows Best?
They watch it.
They just don't want to admit it, yeah. Travis watches it.
I think we are in time, and we should cut here this wonderful conversation. But I don't resist to add a kind of different point of view. If I didn't hear anything and just see the volumes, I mean, it might be my non-American genetic code. I would think about folded surfaces, tectonic folded surfaces, which are amazingly contemporary in a way, and I would think about thermodynamic performance because they are chimneys or they are creating ventilation stack effect, etc., etc. So I think that there is a compositional reading, but there is also a technical reading that is quite interesting in the roof plan proposal. No? I don't think it's so ordinary. I think it's wonderful. Anyway, thank you everyone here.
Thanks so much for coming.